So we're now going to get started. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be joining us today. Thank you for joining us as we host today's program featuring Professor Michiel van Crevel, Professor of Chinese Language and Literature at Leiden University. My name is Paola Jovene, and I am an associate professor of Chinese literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. And I'm also a member of the Center for East Asian Studies of the Center for East Asian Studies China Committee. The Center for East Asian Studies, also known by its acronym CEAS, is a US Department of Education designated National Resource Center at the University of Chicago. CEAS supports a variety of activities on campus and beyond to promote teaching, research, interdisciplinary scholarship, and greater public understanding related to the study of China, Korea, and Japan. For more information on the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies, please visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. These links are being provided in the chat box. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. To ask a question to be addressed during this portion of the program, please be sure to type it in the Q&A box. And now it's really my pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Michiel van Crevel, who joins us today from Leiden. One comment once I've heard about Michiel that really captures who he is and what he does, and this is not a literal quote, but something along the lines of, oh yeah, that super energetic guy who talks about Chinese poetry as if it were rock music. Well, more seriously, I would say that I think that no one would be offended if I say that Michiel is the world's leading scholar of contemporary Chinese poetry, a most prolific author of over a dozen books in Chinese, Dutch, and English. Here I have his monumental research monograph from 2008. The title is Chinese Poetry in Times of Mind, Mayhem, and Money. And also I want to invite everyone to read a really beautiful volume that he co-edited with Lucas Klein titled Chinese Poetry and Translation, Rights and Wrongs, which is actually available open access online. One third thing I will mention about Michiel is that he has built an amazing, unique collection of unofficial poetry journals from China. And this is really a service to the world. It's hosted by the Leiden University Library and digitized for open access. So this is really something that all scholars and interested readers can use. Michiel is currently working toward a book on China's battler poetry. This is a term that he has coined himself, and we'll learn about it today. So please join me in virtually welcoming Professor Michiel van Crevel from Leiden University. Thank you.
Right, Professor Jovene, thank you very much for your welcome, and many thanks to you and your colleagues at the University of Chicago for organizing this. I'm going to invite one of the hosts to start with a video of Deng Xiaoqiong reciting her poetry at Poetry International Festival in 2019 in Rotterdam. We'll just hear about the first half of the poem.
父子命，这些年我沉浸于庞大的时代，感到虚弱无力，鲜活的生命蒙上灰蒙蒙的封顶，无知，他的死亡带了时代的创伤，连同山谷，为赔偿金争执的兄弟、父母，没得人在意的尸体，没得人悲伤，也没得人哭泣，剩下赔偿金，冰凉的数字陪伴。父子命，13岁，死于醉酒。我对他还有那么个清晰的认识， 曾经的同事，后来沦为酒店的娼妓，单纯的微笑，高声谈论，越是的亲人，他跟我谈论，他见到好多所谓人生的真相，站在现实的门槛上。
Okay, if all has gone well, you're now seeing my screen, and I'm going to read my translation of this poem, or the first 15 lines of it or so. It's called Hu Zhimin. These years, I have been immersed in this colossal era and felt weak and powerless, with the force of life covered in endless, tired denial and ignorance. Her death shows the trauma of this era. 3 brothers who quarreled over the compensation money and the parents. No one looked after her dead body. No one grieved and no one wept. Only the ice-cold figure of the money to keep her company. Hu Zhimin, 23, death by alcohol. I have such vivid memories of her, my one-time co-worker, who later at a hotel sank into prostitution. With her innocent smile, loudly talking about the ways of the world. To me, she would say how she had seen so many so-called truths of life standing on the threshold of reality. So this is a powerful specimen of China's battler poetry. I'm going to pull up images of 2 iconic books to give you a sense of what this is all about. This is the richest anthology of this writing, 中国打工诗歌精选, for the period 1985 to 2005. So the best of China's battler poetry for that particular period, published in 2007. And here is Iron Moon, an anthology of Chinese migrant worker poetry, edited by Qin Xiaoyu and translated by Eleanor Goodman, which is at this point the most important resource when it comes to English language translations of this work. So what is battler poetry in plain words? Well, as most, if not all of you know, since the 1980s, something like 300 million people have internally migrated, domestically migrated in China from the rural hinterland to the cities. And these people write poetry, not all of them, but enough of them to lead to the emergence of what is now a widely recognized genre of cultural production, 打工诗歌, battler poetry. This writing addresses their socioeconomic experience, and as such, it is filled with hardship, the hardship of displacement, of discrimination, of precarious labor, and so on. There's also room for opportunity in this poetry, but that tends to sort of lose out. Now, battle poetry is the most prominent genre, perhaps of all subaltern cultural production in the People's Republic of China today, and certainly within the larger category of battler literature, 打工文学. And my definition of battler literature at this point is writing by precarious workers in post-socialist China that addresses their socioeconomic experience. As these things go, in any healthy field of inquiry, definitions are contested, and this is mostly about what I call the preposition game. Is this literature that is necessarily written by people who have first-hand experience of precarious labor? Is it for them? Is it of them in an identificational sense, or even another sense? But I'm going to leave that aside for the moment and move on to issues of terminology. And I'm going to do that by showing you 3 examples of unofficial publications. Just now, Professor Jovine mentioned the archive of unofficial poetry publishing at Leiden University. And one of the interesting things is that publications like this, 打工诗人, which was a groundbreaking publication as early as 2001, kind of establish a lateral connection through the medium of unofficial publishing with elite cultural production. such as modernist poetry, and with LGBTQ cultural production. Again, mostly looking at poetry here. So here we're talking about 打工诗歌, as is evident from the title of the publication, but here there's another journal also unofficially published. This was established in 2007. This issue is from 2009 called 工人诗歌, which literally translates as workers' poetry. I have issues with that, but I won't go into that just now. And then we move on another decade, and here in 2019, we've got something called 新工人文学, which comes out of Pizun, near Beijing, where there is a by now very famous NGO called the Migrant Workers Home that does all sorts of cultural education, including the writing of literature. And, you know, they're doing all kinds of unofficial publications as well, but they don't speak of 打工者 or 工人, so battlers or workers or laborers, but of new workers, 新工人. Now in Chinese, there are plenty more terms to describe these people and what they do in terms of cultural production. And the same thing holds to a somewhat lesser extent, but still in English. So what's wrong with the notion of migrant worker poetry? Well, there's nothing wrong with it. And I think it is, it's very effective. It's just that it is an explanation rather than a translation. If we look at things like the linguistic register, the connotations of such a widely used, sort of daily used word as 打工, which is why I ended up landing on battler poetry using an Australian English colloquialism that also denotes people, sort of members of the precariat, but can also be worn as a badge of pride and solidarity. And that is precisely how 打工 works in Chinese. Now, what is it that makes this material significant? One of the questions you could ask here, and perhaps it sounds a bit naive, if only, you know, because of its sheer scope, but, you know, you could ask, how does this poetry work? What does it mean? And to whom does it mean this? And to start with, we should probably note that vis-a-vis more established literatures, battler poetry is often qualified as unsophisticated and related terms. People might not be loud about saying this, even though some of them have been, including critics and scholars, but this is very definitely part of the discourse, where you end up in something like a zero-sum game that is somehow suggesting that social significance, i.e. a direct connection to issues of inequality in this case, is somehow incompatible with or inversely proportionate to aesthetic value. I'm not, you know, I'm not among those who believe in the zero-sum game, but it's an important part of the discourse, so we somehow need to sort of navigate it. Now, another thing to think about immediately is, what is the place of this battler poetry or battler literature more broadly in the genealogy of, let's say, worker literature broadly defined in modern China? So from the Republican era through to the high socialist era, proletarian literature, etc., up to the present. Fortunately, we've now finally got the article that we need on that topic by Paola Iovine and Federico Picerni in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature, setting this out through time, but also with beautiful sort of, you know, horizontal comparisons. If you ask me, which is in a sense what you're doing by attending today's webinar, I suppose, I think that this poetry is first of all about social identification in the battler community and possibly beyond it. It is also about the restoration of dignity in the precarious worker as a reading and writing subject. It's also about advocacy and in some cases about activism, even though, of course, you know, there's very little room for activism at the moment in the PRC. And finally, in a very few cases, it is about socioeconomic betterment of the author. And in fact, Zheng Xiaoqiong is an example of that fourth issue, socioeconomic betterment. By now, she is no longer a precarious worker, but somebody with job security in a great job. But she is the exception rather than the rule, and that is putting it mildly. Now, in China, still talking about significance, of course, poetry is a social practice and has been since antiquity, and is known as such beyond the Chinese borders as well. And in that sense, you can sort of think about battler poetry as being connected to the use of poetry by court officials, 2 millennia ago. At the same time, what is clear is that battler poetry is capable of addressing a notable variety of audiences in China and abroad. So the battlers themselves, but also mainstream media, and also, and I'm going to give you a visual for that, labor activists. So here we've got the China Labor Bulletin remembering Xu Lizhi, who is the second best known battler poet in China, from China. In addition to labor activists, there is what I've called in my notes the poetry people, people that organize festivals, that go to festivals, including translators, of course. And then there are academics. So the list might go on, but I think this is pretty impressive for a particular subgenre of poetry in terms of its ability to address various audiences. Now, if we turn to what I called foreign work on battler poetry in the abstract, I should probably first clarify what I mean by that. And what I mean by this is that this work is published outside China in other languages than Chinese. And work can encompass interlingual translation, but can also encompass cultural translation. And I'd be happy to go into various definitions of cultural translation in the Q&A, but I'm going to skip that for the moment and just say that I'm using a definition offered by Anthony Pym in 2014 when he called cultural translation the general activity of communication between cultural groups. That's nice and broad, gives me plenty of space to sort of work with. And what is important to me for this particular paper is that I take mainstream media, serious mainstream media efforts and scholarship as cultural translation for today's presentation. Now, what is truly striking once we start looking at what's there, the inventory of cultural translation and interlingual translation of battler poetry into English and into other languages, I've done some work outside English as well, is that almost all of this is on Zheng Xiaoqiong. Then there is Xu Lizhi, and then there is basically nobody else. There is scattered references to other poets, 1 or 2 poems here or there, maybe 10 or 20 poems, but Zheng Xiaoqiong is basically, has monopolized the stage. I'm not saying she's doing this on purpose, or it would be within her power to do so, but this is pretty much what we're looking at. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I believe it's obvious how this works. One of them is that for what you could call canon formation in translation, i.e., what do people in Spain or in Romania or in the Philippines know about Chinese literature? You're always going to get a pretty serious trimming down of what's available in terms of authors and texts. So there's something like a natural delay, right? What's famous in China today is not necessarily going to be famous outside China today. As for Xu Lizhi, that is a very complex story on which I've published elsewhere, and far be it for me to simplify it. But I'm not going to go into that today and simply say that his visibility is a consequence of his suicide. He was an employee of Foxconn, a factory, a company that is well known for its brutal labor regimes. And he ended his life in 2014 at a very tender age. And that's sort of what led to a media explosion around his life story and his poetry. And this was very definitely also to do with the fact that he was more or less, at that point, less known as a poet, because of course there are plenty more Foxconn suicides that sort of didn't make the news in the way that Xu Lizhi did. So we know why Xu Lizhi is there in as much as he is, and we know why plenty of other authors are perhaps not there yet. But that doesn't really tell us yet. Looking at media productions like this about Xu Lizhi in Time 2014, a piece by Emily Rohala, the poet who died for your phone. So we get that. We know why this is happening, but it doesn't really tell us yet why is everyone translating Zheng Xiaoqiong, which is basically the question that is at the heart of this paper. Now, as I move on into the actual argument, I'm first going to be talking about interlingual translation for a little bit. And to just illustrate that, I'm going to pull up again the cover of Iron Moon, the anthology of migrant worker poetry done by Qin Xiaoyu and Eleanor Goodman, the translator, and reflect a little bit on the interlingual translation of battler poetry at large as a genre, not necessarily Deng Xiaoqiong, in particular. So first of all, this poetry in the source texts and in translation happens at what we can call the nexus of aesthetics and social experience. And of course, social experience here translates directly into issues of increasing inequality in Chinese society and worldwide. And in that sense, speaking from a translation studies perspective, it is wise to adopt a functionalist perspective, to basically say what drives the translation of this poetry. And in a brief and simplifying summary, I could say, well, there is definitely an aesthetic impulse, right? There are translators. Eleanor Goodman is a very good example. She is a widely recognized and highly accomplished translator of Chinese poetry and a poet herself, and plenty of aesthetic impulses there. But there is also something else in Goodman's work and in the work of others, and that is what we might call a moral impulse. Now, this moral impulse could also extend to what we could call an activist impulse, or minimally a testimonial impulse. Look what's happening here to the precariat, or a documentary approach, even more modest. And these things affect the translation of battler poetry in minimally two ways. One, the selection of source texts, right? Which are the poems that you think are going to work? And then secondly, the word choice in the actual translations. Now, of course, this is a claim that holds for poetry translation generically, or perhaps for literary translation generically. But the effects in this case, because of the nexus of aesthetics and social experience, are very immediately visible. Of course, the aesthetic and the moral impulse are anything but mutually exclusive. And in fact, it is their synergy that makes this work interesting. And that is obviously a topic in Marxist cultural theory. Now, these translations appear in various venues. They appear, for example, in small press publishing, just like modernist or avant-garde poetry, elite poetries. They appear at literary festivals. You just saw a video of Poetry International, plenty of modernist poetry there to go around there as well. But they also appear in labor activist settings, and we've seen an example of that, and in mainstream media, of which we just saw this example in Time magazine. So the translation strategies for battler poetry, they don't just differ on account of how individuals work or how they were trained or how they identify as translators, but they also differ institutionally, because a labor activism platform is going to work differently with translations than a literary festival of the generic type. My next topic, so to speak, big topic, is the author as synecdoche. And to illustrate that, I'm going to pull up still from the video that you were looking at just now. So this is Deng Xiaoqiong in 2019 in Rotterdam. I was in the audience, which was over 1,000. And the notion of the author as synecdoche connects with what I said about national canon formation in translation. Basically, you've got fewer authors, fewer texts to go around. Attention to the names that sort of get there first could snowball. And thus, and here I'm just going to read a little bit from the paper, it is especially in translation vis-a-vis a foreign audience that a single author can come to operate as a synecdoche for entire literary genres or periods, or indeed for a national culture, and become the face of that genre, period, or culture. So think of Confucius for Chinese culture, Confucius Institutes, Goethe for German or German language culture, think of the Goethe Institutes, Shakespeare for English literature, or Lu Xun for modern Chinese literature. Now, in itself, it's not a problem if individual authors like Lu Xun become the subject of unending scrutiny and discussion. That's fine, I have no problem with that. But there is, of course, the risk of over-concentration and the flip side of that, which is that others remain unheard and unstudied. At this point, Deng Xiaoqiong is very definitely the face of China's battler poetry in that sense. First it's Zheng, then it's Xu Lizhi, and then, you know, after a considerable distance and a lot of silence, some scattered other names and texts. And this holds for both interlingual translations and for author studies, right, including cultural translation. Now this takes us to where I want to go today. And this is this notion of hyper-translatability. I was kind of hoping that putting this in the title of the talk would attract people. I may be misguided here. And my definition of hyper-translatability for now is that it is a varying set of features that make certain texts elicit especially high numbers of translations, whose perspectives on the source text and its reproduction may diverge widely and indeed irreconcilably. I thought a lot about that word elicit, but I'm going to stick with it for now. So the interesting thing about hypertranslatability is the idea started not when I was thinking about oeuvres or, you know, texts in full, but about individual words. In particular, these words were minjian and jianghu. So I should probably say now that I'm not going to attempt to translate them. If you're interested in this, check out a piece that is called Walk on the Wild Side, Snapshots of the Chinese Poetry Scene. It's kind of a small book online on a fieldwork experience in China and what that made me think about. And then my reason for bringing this up and trying to sort of plug it into the discourse is to offer an alternative to the notion of untranslatability, and the scare quotes have a reason. It's not meant to be a substitute for this notion, just an alternative. It is in recognition of what we might call the supra-individual, i.e. not limited to any single person, but yeah, something that might run through a culture, through a linguistic community and so on. The supra-individual continuing urge to translate and to re-translate, right? Why are there dozens of translations of Homer or of the Dao De Jing for that matter? And it's also meant to help us get away from the very tired metaphor of loss and related notions to describe translation. Now, the usual suspects when we talk about untranslatability, thus qualified, are poetry, philosophy, locally rooted texts, by which I mean texts that are implicitly full of implicit cultural and historical references that make it difficult to sort of, you know, simply serve them up to a foreign reader. And then there is a fourth category that I'm going to disregard here, that is religious texts that are institutionally prohibited from being translated. So I'm not going to look at that at this point. And the problem here is a widespread obsession with equivalence and related notions, not just in professional translation studies. Translation studies actually more or less weaned itself off of this notion, but you know, the rest of the world maybe hasn't yet, and we should probably be working on that. And Nick Admeson is one of various scholars in the China studies community who've written on this. And perhaps it bears reiteration to assert that translation is not replication. And in fact, when we think about translation, we might want to start by thinking about difference or change as our points of departure rather than anything like equivalence. Now, this is not a new idea, right? Interventions along these lines in this spirit have been made since, you know, for the last 50 years or so. And take a wild guess who said this, paraphrased by somebody else: the more untranslatable a text, the more insistently it begs and demands to be translated. And yes, that was Jacques Derrida, paraphrased by Theo Hermans, one of the leading scholars of translation studies, and has been so since the 1970s, I believe. He's retired, but still going strong, if I'm not mistaken. So how can hyper-translatability help us to work with the usual suspects, poetry, philosophy, and locally rooted texts? Does it work for philosophy? And I'm going to be offering you a few examples from the China field. I'm not going to go into great detail, just give you sort of a few pointers here. Yes, it works for philosophy. Just look at the vast number of Lao Tzu translations. I mentioned it just now, Dao De Jing. How about poetry? Yes, it works for poetry. Surprise, surprise. So let me read from the paper here again. Poetry can privilege polyvalence and ambiguity through the layered interaction of sound, sense, syntax, and social and cultural contexts. These interactions can be arbitrary, for example, in the relation between signifier and signified across different languages. They can also be radically innovative, with extreme cases that count as nonsensical by conventional standards, but effectively nonsensical. So one might say that there is a complex coincidence at the heart of this kind of poetry. And as a particular iteration of the creative imperative, poetry invites the translator time and again to choose which rule they wish to break, without the prospect of getting it right. But the absence of this prospect, not knowing whether you're going to get it right, can be an opportunity rather than a threat. And thus poetry is known to generate multiple and contested translations of single source texts, with, for example, the work of Paul Celan as a very well-known example across many languages, including Chinese, and here I'm pointing to work by Joanna Grenz. Thirdly, what about the locally rooted texts? Well, they come in many forms. And if the usefulness of the notion of hypertranslatability is less straightforward for this category, it is no less palpable, as I hope to show below. So in sum, if we shift perspective from untranslatability to hypertranslatability, the primary question is no longer what frustrates translation, but what stimulates it, and what explains why certain source texts elicit so much of it. So here, text should be taken very broadly to include the larger story of the literature in question. For example, not just Zheng Xiaoqing's poetry, but also her life story, her media appearances, and so on. So as we think about translatability, there are two operative notions that I kind of want to look at again. One is what I called the complex coincidence of sound, sense, syntax, etc. So in the China field, you could look at classical Chinese poetry, highly formalized, but you could also look at contemporary work, for example, by Che Qianzi, translated by Huang Yunte. But this sort of thing, the complex coincidence, doesn't really especially apply to battler poetry. I'm not saying that it is irrelevant. I'm not saying there's nothing to say about it, but it's not the kind of poetry that kind of brings this to the forefront. It's not sort of at the top of the list. And the second notion is one of distance. And we could start by talking about unknownness and otherness. But I prefer talking about distance, not least because I believe that spatial metaphors work well in imagining translation. A famous example is that of the bridge, right? Even though the bridge can also be a wall, right? Once you start looking more closely. So let's talk about distance. Now, otherness, unknownness, right, could be to do with cultural allusions. Again, an example from the China field, let's say you write a poem in the early 1970s and it features the word Taiyang, the sun. Any native reader at that point is going to associate that with Mao Zedong. And minimally, the author is going to be aware that if they write this up, that is how the reader is going to see it. Now, that kind of thing can be difficult to translate. So if we talk about distance, rather than focusing on the cultural historical components, I want to focus on what I call the social component of this distance to talk about translatability. And this can lead to what might strike you as a counterintuitive question. And this question is, might it be the case that translatability can actually be enhanced by greater distance when we talk about the social component of distance? Because normally we feel that, well, proximity is going to work, right? Whatever is closer is going to be easier to translate. Think, for example, of the social distance between the socioeconomic experience of precarious workers in China, of the most successful poets among them, like Zheng Xiaoqing, and of the latter's translators, who are not usually subaltern subjects themselves, perhaps with a few exceptions. This is not just about interlingual translators. Again, this is also about cultural translators, including academics and people working in mainstream media. So let's look at an example of mainstream media. Here I'm going to use part of a longer quote from the paper, but I think we have time to do so. And I've looked at the New York Times in 2014 and 2021. And in this period in the 2010s, they published on battler poetry, even though they didn't yet know that it was called battler poetry, several times. So, quote from the paper, while battler poetry indexes hardships that are recognized throughout the world, such as assembly line labor and the experience of displacement that comes with migration, its purchase on the foreign reader is evidenced by its cultural translation across vast distances in foreign media, when the poetry comes embedded in what we may call China stories. So in 2014, Didi Kirsten Tetlow suggests that battler poets may be the most penetrating chroniclers of the dramatic economic and social transformation of China since 1978. And in 2021, Vivian Wang's portrait of Chen Yanxi, another poet, explains his success as an author when she charts his hard-scrabble background against the backdrop of China's breakneck economic growth, of which she notes that it has collided with growing awareness of the human toll exacted. Thus, the foreign reader sees a downtrodden subject writing poetry and claiming their dignity against the odds in the shadow of an oppressive state that is in cahoots with global capitalism. And what is more, the writing is part of an other cultural tradition in which poetry as a social practice can be imagined to extend from court officials in antiquity to precarious workers today, as I mentioned before. Media moments like this highlight how distance can actually enhance the translatability of battler poetry. So when we talk about this social distance, it might be the case that this is especially capable of activating what I've called the moral impulse for the translation of battler poetry. And this process is reinforced by the media genicity of China's subaltern cultural production. Sun Wanning, a leading scholar in this field, has published on this minimally since 2004 and probably before. And it sounds paradoxical, but China's migrant workers are incredibly mediagenic, and it's obvious that a measure of voyeurism of various types might come in here. The sort of ant-like figures on vast construction sites donning yellow safety helmets, robot-like figures who are, chained to the assembly line, and so on and so forth. Now, as we move on, there's a warning here, and that is, I have a couple of very crowded slides coming up. So the kind of thing that you tell your students not to do. So fasten your seatbelts. Some keywords, some key work here. And this is in a sense, as a preface to what I want to be saying when I focus on battler poetry's translation and then on Zheng Xiaotong to sort of pull things together. I want to highlight the work of three people. Justina Jaguschik, who was very early. This is an example of one of her earliest publications on battler poetry, also featuring Zheng Xiaoqiong. Then there is Zhou Xiaojing, who published in 2020 a monograph on Zheng Xiaoqiong, the women migrant workers, and the title is actually a book title. It's a book that we'll talk about later. And then there is Sun Wanning, whom I mentioned just now, who has been a leading scholar as regards subaltern cultural production from a media studies perspective, but sort of working together with humanities scholars all the time. So this is kind of, these are three names that I want to have mentioned before I lay out my ideas for the answer to the question of why everyone is translating Zheng Xiaoqiong. Okay. First of all, just like for Battler's poetry at large, the notion of this complex coincidence that would, for example, help you when you think about Paul Celan or when you think about translating classical Chinese poetry is not terribly important. Again, I'm going to qualify this emphatically with reference to work by Margaret Hillenbrand, among others. Hillenbrand's close readings of Zheng Xiaoqiong's poetry show that there is plenty to say about these layered interactions and innovation, these relations between signifier and signified and the rest of it. However, the dynamics of Zheng's poetry, most of which is in free verse and much of which has important narrative elements and advocates for social justice, does not really hinge on formal features or on what I've called effective nonsensicality. So we need to look elsewhere. So in addition to the argument about social distance and about mediogenicity, this is a generic argument that holds for the genre of battler poetry and battler literature at large. What makes Zheng Xiaoqing special? What energizes the distance, so to speak, to the point where she just about monopolizes the stage? I have 5 ideas to pull this together. So first of all, unsurprisingly perhaps, this is about talent and dedication. All accounts show us, including her autobiographical writing, but also writings by other people, interviews, media, you name it, that for the last 20 years or so, she has undertaken a systematic, fanatical, and sustained effort at training herself as a literary author and then specifically as a poet. She's an accomplished poet. And when I say this, that is not another way of saying that she knows how to make battler poetry sing along with more established literatures after all. My second idea here is that she manages to address and captivate a particularly diverse audience. So I've said this thing about the diversity of the audience for battler poetry at large, but Zheng Xiaoqing is particularly skilled in addressing these audiences. First of all, we could think about the 2 worlds of cultural production and literary production in China today. Certainly for poetry, there is an unofficial world which is as important as the official world, if not more important. And Zheng Xiaoqing, from the word go, has operated in both seamlessly, which is striking and interesting in itself. And I've written on that elsewhere, but I'm not going to go into that now. So, but also across China's borders, for example, generic poetry festivals like Poetry International in Rotterdam, but also migrant worker dedicated events like the events organized out of Singapore for the last 10 years or so. Then there is a third idea. She has the perfect life story to make this happen. Her life story is very definitely one of rags to riches. She was born in Nantung in rural Sichuan, and at age 20 or 21, relocated to Dongguan, 2,000 kilometers away in the Pearl River Delta. If the workshop of the world is anywhere, it is in Dongguan. If you have not been and you have a chance to go there, you should. It is impressive. From being a factory worker in Dongguan for about 8 years, she worked her way up. She wrote her way up to being a recognized poet, and then an editor, and then a ranking editor at a nationally recognized literary journal with job security and a cultural official. The first time I met Zheng Xiaoqing, which was in the fall of 2016, she had just come back together with Yang Ke, who I think is the chairperson of the Guangdong Province Writers Association, from visiting Beijing, where they had heard Xi Jinping speak on culture. Now, in a neoliberal vision, that story is one of an extraordinary achievement through self-reliance and positive energy, 正能量. In an idealist vision that sees the artist as uniquely equipped to address society's ills, especially in a politically oppressive environment, it might be a tale of poetic justice. And in what we might call a cynical political vision, it might be a story of co-optation, of the erasure of other voices, of the packaging of Zheng Xiaoqing, perhaps through no fault of her own, in order to prevent organized resistance at, however modest a level. My fourth idea is that of big themes. Zheng Xiaoqing's poetry speaks to big themes, and this takes us directly to scholarship as cultural translation, bearing in mind the names of the scholars that I've mentioned before, without wanting to detract from the value of the dozens of others who've written on this stuff. We've got a great bibliography. I'm going to show you that in a minute, but for now I'm focusing on these people. So first of all, there is the big theme of precarity. Well, that's not just a big theme in Chinese studies, and Margaret Hillenbrand, again, is one who has noted that in precarity studies, China is somehow strangely lacking when we look at horizontal connections across these sort of area studies and linguistic and cultural boundaries. Of course, other battler poets and other subaltern cultural producers address this theme as well, and they do so very effectively. But I would venture that it is Deng Xiaoqung's insistence, if you will, and her systematicity in addressing this that makes it special. Sort of underneath the umbrella of precarity, we could talk about subalternity, and then the name that you're going to think of is Sun Banning, obviously. We could think about gender and the patriarchy, and again, among other names, you're going to definitely be thinking about Justyna Jagušik's work. We could think about ecological destruction as a consequence of global capitalism, and you are very definitely going to be thinking of Dou Xiaojing's work. Now, moving on to the final and fifth idea. This is a quote from Sun Banning in a forthcoming article. We could think about Deng Xiaoqung as a self-appointed anthropologist. Sun Banning presents a sociological reading of this book published in 2012 called 女工记, which I translate as Stories of Women Workers. This is the literary record of what we might call a non-academic type of fieldwork in which Deng documents the ordeal of women migrant workers she encountered when she was a factory worker in Dongguan herself. And Sun proposes to read stories as, and I quote, a source of empirical data that sociologists of intimacy, limited by their analytical lens and framework, could not possibly unearth. And I love it when she says, limited by their analytical lens. She sees Deng Xiaoqung as a self-appointed anthropologist and says that her ethnographic work offers a counterweight to perspectives taken on female precarious labor by the Chinese government, the Chinese middle class, and foreign scholars and other scholars. She also considers the potential of this book to offer useful discursive resources for subaltern politics, and I would add that I think it is highly unlikely that a book like this could have come out in the years since. What we've seen in terms of censorship would make that unlikely. Now, Sun ponders the development of Deng's relationship with the rural migrant community, right? She's a migrant worker, then sort of leaves that community as she morphs from a regular inside member of that community into an outsider who retains access of a type that would be unthinkable if she could not partake of a vast shared experience with the community. And in a fitting expression, Sun Banning calls this relationship amphibian. I would add to this that this amphibianism also brings to mind relationships that operate in the opposite direction between the poet as ethnographer on the one hand and scholars such as Jagušik, Sun, and Dou on the other. And thus, for battler poetry, and especially for Deng Xiaoqung, Sun's essay is an eye-catching instance of cultural translation in Anthony Pim's definition as the general activity of communication between cultural groups. This emerges in various constellations of these groups in China and elsewhere. And by now, you probably know the list. Precarious workers, the most successful poets among them, government cultural officials, those working in activism and advocacy, journalists and other media makers, scholars, interlingual translators, and the various audiences of these groups. Now, single bodies, individual human beings can straddle these categories. And of course, Deng herself is the best possible example. Finally, and I've argued this elsewhere in an article called No One in Control, so that's eminently Googleable, in Comparative Critical Studies, just came out last year. Deng has exceptional skill in navigating the very complex force field that surrounds battler poetry and subaltern cultural production more broadly. And that this is, a notion that might serve as a capstone on this explanation in 5 parts of the hyper-translatability of Deng Xiaoqung. Now let's step back for a moment and, go to this website, the MCLC Resource Center. I trust that there are many people in the audience who use this on a daily basis. I do. And let's look at the thematic bibliographies. Now, since a couple of years, we've had one on migrant workers and subalternity, and I should probably plead guilty here and do a bit of full disclosure because I'm behind this. I wrote to Kirk Denton and said, I think it's time we do this, and he was good enough to let me do it. It was great to work with a large number of scholars who've been working on this, and this bibliography is growing very rapidly as we speak. And for the big picture, one of the great things about this is, did you know how much fun it can be to scroll through a bibliography? Is it will really give you an idea of how powerful this particular topic is as a thematic topic that speaks to various fields of inquiry. This is not just humanities, it is not just social science either, it happens in between. It is interdisciplinary by nature, so to speak. And then we can bring in serious media makers, etc. What's not to like? To conclude the paper, I'm going to read the final two paragraphs. They're called a coda in the actual paper to sort of try and pull things together and again step back and sort of see the bigger picture. Why is everyone translating Deng Xiaoqun? Might sound skeptical if the question were taken out of context. Also, in what is perhaps a suspicious type of recursiveness, this essay tries to explain a phenomenon to which I have contributed myself by flagging Deng's high visibility more than once in earlier publications, and now by dedicating an entire essay to it. The recursiveness is justified by the need to step back and consider the emergence of this instance of Chinese poetry in the world, meaning both battler poetry at large and the phenomenon called Deng Xiaoqun. As for the question, this is of course anything but skeptical. Rather, it wants to kick off an attempt to understand how Deng contributes to a dynamic that sees battler poetry speaking to a range of foreign readers beyond scholarship in the humanities and beyond literary translation, from social scientists to labor activists and mainstream journalists. Translatability, untranslatability, hypertranslatability, they work differently for battler poetry than for high culture types of poetry. But this is precisely why it is helpful to rethink them as part of an ongoing engagement with subaltern cultural production that compels us to revisit perennial questions of aesthetics and social experience. Relieved that I had that on the screen. Now, this engagement with these issues raises equally perennial questions of structure and agency, such as in the force field that I've mentioned surrounding battler poetry and its translation at large on the one hand, and Deng Xiaoqun's individual trajectory on the other hand. That this essay has remarked on the importance of an individual author's agency should not make us lose sight of the structural factors that I've outlined above, nor should it keep us from exploring how these play out for battlers poets whose voices remain unheard to date. Now, my notes say that if there is time, I'm going to read another poem, and there is actually time according to my clock. So bear with me for another 2 minutes. I'd like to conclude my presentation by reading to you a poem by Deng Xiaoqun in my translation called Woman Worker, Youth Fixed in a Seat. Time's giant beak yawns. Moonlight on the machine turns to rust. Exhausted, dim, turbid. The peril in her heart gurgling, flowing by. The body's cliffs collapse. Mud and crushed stone. Shards of time. Clog up the rivers running through a woman's body. The tide in disarray, out of sync with the season. She sits in her seat. The products flowing by interlock with time. Swallow it down. So quickly grown old. 10 years have flowed by like water. A giant wariness wells up in her mind. For many years, she has stood guard over the screws. One screw, another screw. Turn to the left, to the right, fixing her dreams and her youth to a product, watching her pallid youth, running always from the rural hinterland to a city on the seaboard, then to a store shelf in the US. Exhaustion and occupational disease accumulate in her lungs, stick in her throat, her period no longer on time, her coughing fierce. In the development zone beyond the factory, the lychee trees are felled. The machines around her are shaking. She kneads her eyes, red and swollen, then takes her self and sticks it in between the products flowing by. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Van Krivel, for this really profound and inspiring presentation that you gave us as a scholar of Chinese literature, as a translator, and as a scholar and theorist of translation. I want to invite everyone to write questions in the chat box, but maybe I will start off with some brief comment and question. You guided us through a very complex and articulate presentation, at the center of which was the question of what can explain the translatability of Zheng Xiaoqiong's poetry. And you propose this concept of hyper-translatability, which you invite us to consider in tension or even alternative to the obsession, if we can say so, with the notion of untranslatable. And you propose 5 possible reasons for the hyper-translatability of Zheng Xiaoqiong, which is talent and dedication, the fact that she addresses a particularly diverse audience, her perfect life story, the fact that she addresses big themes, and the fact that her work and dedication to her co-workers, and the fact that she, as Sun Wanning has proposed, she is a sort of self-appointed anthropologist. But I think that at the end of the day, by concluding your talk, by starting and ending your talk with your translation of her poems, actually what seems to dominate at the end is the power of her poetry. So I really appreciate the tensions that your talk presents, because there are all these contextual elements, but at the end you also remind us that there is a power in this poetry that's undeniable. Now, I think you give us a very capacious notion of translation, and you tease it out for us in terms of interlingual translation and cultural translation. I was curious to ask if you have any thoughts to share on a particular cultural translation that's, however, intralingual, which is to say, if there are, I think most of your categories could address both the work of translation that happens across languages and across distinct cultural spheres, but they can also address the context, say, within the Chinese language cultural sphere. And so I wanted to ask if you can tease out a bit more whether there are elements, if we can say, in the cultural translation, in the way you use it within the Chinese sphere, that help explain or add even more dimension to the translatability of her poetry. I'm not sure if the question is clear. I can elaborate more if you wish.
The question is very clear, and I wish I could be as concise as you were when you went straight to the heart of the analysis. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, what you touch on in the introduction to your question is something that I think we need to be carrying on about. And that is, and I'm going to make a bit of a sweeping generalization now, but that is the fact that in writing about subaltern cultural production, and then if we want to focus on, you know, a linguistic medium like literature, we shouldn't forget that this is not just about paraphrasable messages. If it were, then, you know, why are these people writing poetry, right? Why aren't they publishing op-eds, which they're also doing? But, you know, opinion pieces are different from poetry, is different from fiction, etc., etc. And I think this cannot be said often enough, because it is understandable, if only because of the moral impulse and the testimonial impulse, to focus on the horrors of a young woman being forced into prostitution and, you know, death by alcohol at age 23. And it makes it all too easy to forget about the rest, to forget about the rhythm, to forget about Zheng Xiaoqiong's very subtle use of enjambment, crossing over from one line into the next, etc. So this point cannot be made often enough. At the same time, on the notion of cultural translation, of course, I said that, you know, I'd focus on Anthony Pim's definition because it really works for me now. But a couple of years ago, I did some work on this, let's say, on what, you know, what gets said about cultural translation in translation studies. It's huge, right? And by now, it's very interesting. The last couple of years, we've actually seen a number of books coming out with this expression in their title. But at the time, this was 2017 or so, I ended up dividing the scholarship into three categories, roughly. One saying it's interlingual translation that is culturally inflected. Most literary translators would, you know, sort of say duh to you if you said that, because they wouldn't be able to imagine literary translation not being culturally inflected. One being the anthropological notion of the translation of culture. Now, in the singular, culture, that still stands and continues to be used in anthropological literature. In the plural, the translation of cultures, where we think of sort of hermetically sealed off cultures that are transported by the colonial traveler / scholar to other audiences. Talal Asad in the 1980s kind of, you know, dealt with that. And then there is a third category, which would take us to authors like Homi Bhabha in the 1990s. And that's more or less where I sit when I draw on Anthony Pim and talk about the general activity of communication between cultural groups. But you are absolutely right that we could point to any number of groups inside China that are cultural groups that are appreciably different in socioeconomic experience, and that hence, you know, there might be a need for, or the possibility of, cultural translation taking place intralingually. In 2017, I published on this. So in the Journal of Modern Literature in Chinese, it's available in open access. It's called The Cultural Translation of Battler Poetry, I think. I think I also put Da Gong Suge in Pinyin in the title, but there I sort of really go into that, and I focus on a couple of groups, which I know from your work interests you, because these groups include what we might call orthodox or establishment literary critics, who very interestingly in the mid-2000s kind of bounced back into something that is close to Maoist critical discourse on literature, saying, finally, the poets are no longer playing word games and they're actually writing about stuff that matters, meaning 生存, subsistence, right? So that debate is a little scary. Then there are cultural officials. There is the mainstream media audiences, which reminds me of the word voyeurism that I mentioned in the talk. And yes, that cultural translation can very definitely take place intralingually, and it would probably be safe to say that very similar things happen vertically, as it were, when we look at not just the translation of images of poetry and poethood in pre-modern China into the present day, but also, in fact, a very specific connection that is often made by a claim to some sort of anchorage to a legacy between battler poetry on the one hand and the poetry of the Shi Jing, the Book of Odes, on the other hand. So your question is right on the money, and thank you very much.
Thank you. But just to follow up, there is no particular element that would in particular justify, so to speak, the hypertranslatability of Zheng Xiaoqiong in particular in these terms. So it's not, there's not, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
no,
Thank
I mean,
you so much.
that is very perspicacious. I mean, you're absolutely right in pointing that out. I mean, for example, number 5 would be fun to sort of think more about. What I find very interesting in the article by Sun Wanning, which I know through your work, basically, as an editor, is that I think she establishes very interesting connections between sort of foreign scholarship on the one hand and perhaps Chinese cultural production on the other. So, foreign is parenthesized, I think also literally in her paper. But no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Thanks. I see that Professor Hong Sosi has a question on hypertranslatability, and I was wondering if you'd like to, I think if you'd like to ask the question yourself, or otherwise I can read it. Yes, Hong, thank you.
Yes, hi. Well, Mario, it's wonderful to hear from you. My question has to do with the relation of style and theme in the poetry that you're calling hypertranslatable. Is it always the case that style and theme are going hand in hand, or are there cases of Dagong Shiren whose style can be at variance with the subject matter, right? You might think of irony or using a high literary style that would seem to be out of place with their subject matter. Does that ever happen? Because that would be an interesting case, I think, to qualify some of the characteristics that seem to account for the hypertranslatability, as you put it.
Yep. Thank you very much. Point taken. And again, I think this is right on the money as well. I'm not saying that for any particular reason. I haven't been bribed to say that today. But yeah, style and theme. And of course, I mean, it'd be very, very interesting to address these issues, also bringing in the notion of iconicity, which matters a great deal in poetry per se, and in poetry translation, which is also poetry per se. So if I go back to your phrasing, do they always go hand in hand? And then you cite as 2 examples, irony and high literary material. Deng Xiaoqiong would be a very interesting example herself, but she's by no means the only one. And I think that actually sort of reinforces the need for us to look beyond these people who sort of become the face of the genre. I plead guilty, but I'm also looking at other people in my defense. And this also takes me to another issue that would, in fact, reconnect with Paula's question, because this is something that people outside China, I believe, or outside Chinese culture, or not necessarily familiar with Chinese culture, might be surprised by. And that is what in Chinese you'd sort of call the level of culturedness or of cultural education of the individual in question. So not least because of the very, very difficult socioeconomic circumstances in contemporary China, many precarious workers, have completed minimally high school and quite often more than that. Vocational training, like Zheng Xiaoqiong, she went to a nursing school, but also people with college degrees. There was this book in the very beginning of the talk on the left of the screen, the 中国大公是个精选, edited by Xu Qiang, Luo Duyan, and Chen Zhongcun. And Xu Qiang has a college education, very different from his co-editor Chen Zhongcun, who was literally one of these people who, when they started submitting their manuscripts to literary journals, could never include a return address because they were living in dormitories on construction sites, so wouldn't get their stuff sent back to them. And this, to my mind, adds depth to the textual analysis and the tension that I think your question indicates as well. And yes, to qualifying the notion and its applicability of hypertranslatability, although I haven't meant to say, maybe I haven't expressed myself clearly, I haven't meant to say that this genre or all of Deng Xiaoqung's work is always going to be hypertranslatable. The reconnection back to Paula's question is that I think that if we were to look for things that work differently inside China than outside it, and by China, then I mean a cultural community, this might also have to do with the notion of poethood, the image of poethood and its implications. It's not as if this notion is absent in the world outside China, by no means. And there are other cultures where, for example, this is very, very emphatically present in Iran and Indonesia and other places. But I hope these things kind of, cobbled together help to answer at least part of your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that has to do with, again, the special case of Zheng Xiaoqung. And there is one question, for instance, asking, is there another contemporary poet whose work you will call hypertranslatable? And then a related question, in a way, by Shi Qilin. How do you attend to the uniqueness of each poet and their poetry without flattening each of their interventions in the general grouping of Butler poets? And so I think I'll ask these two questions about translation.
Yeah, could you repeat the second question about the flattening? I missed a little bit there.
Yes, actually, I'll add one more. So I grouped together 3 questions about translation. The first one was, is there another contemporary poet whose work you will call hypertranslatable? And I know you mentioned Xu Lizhi, but I wonder if maybe this person who's asking is wondering about someone else. Yep. The second question is, when studying Butler poetry, how do you attend to the uniqueness of each poet and their poetry without flattening each of their interventions in the general grouping of Butler poets? And this person is actually a PhD candidate, UC Irvine. They also ask, how would you compare to other poets like, I don't know the tones of these names actually, Wu Xia and Chen Nianxi. Yeah. And then finally, maybe a more, maybe a challenging question. If you can, by Mingbao Yue, if you can share your thoughts on Paul Ricoeur's book on translation and its emphasis on translation as being an ethical undertaking because it poses the ultimate test of the foreign. And this person says, I think it resonates well with your thoughts on the challenges of translating Butler poetry. And do you think that Zheng Xiaoqung's own poetry fits into Ricoeur's theory of translation? Can her poetry being seen as a translation in Ricoeur's sense? So these are 3 questions on translation. Mm-hmm.
Right. Have you got about 2.5 hours?
I know.
Thanks for giving me all this stuff. I mean, this is great sharing as well. Can I think of another contemporary poet who is hypertranslatable? Again, if I, perhaps I haven't expressed myself clearly. I'm not intending to sort of go around and stick labels on people and saying, this person counts as hypertranslatable, that one doesn't. I do think that Deng Xiaoqung is exceptional. I do think that she is exceptional. Especially in things like the crossing over between very unofficial scenes and very official scenes, which is not just something that you need to have a certain ability to handle yourself, but is also something that is typically, well, not invariably, appreciated by your audiences. And I was struck during field work and since in sort of, the sort of WeChat communications that many of us are engaged in all the time, by how well she does that. But I digress. I think I'd like to bounce the question back and say, I would like us to think about more other individual Butler poets. And well, Paula knows that I've been working hard on minimally one other person who I think, the study of whose work might be inspired by these ideas. His work is also being worked on by other scholars, including Federico Picerni, translated, I think, by Tammy Liming Ho as well, and that is Xiaohai. And again, I could look at other cases and we could play a little bit with the moral impulse, the documentary impulse, the testimonial impulse, the level of advocacy, or think about Mu Cao, China's first openly gay poet, who mostly publishes basically underground and unofficially because his stuff just cannot be published in present-day China, and many unofficial editors won't do it either. Again, there you could bring in another perspective, like him writing about the truly Black factories and life there, like him writing about same-sex relationships, etc. It's just that I believe that this notion of hypertranslatability can help us to sort of pull these things together and see where the synergy happens, how this incredible momentum can develop, how it is, for example, that the New York Times writes about this poetry, you know, several times in the space of a decade. And I'm pretty sure they haven't done anything of the sort when it comes to modernist or avant-garde poetry, the possible exception of, say, Beidao, and then, you know, exile comes into the picture. So I think that's how I would like to, for the notion to operate at this point. I'm kind of, you know, offering it to the field, and let's see if we can work with it, so to speak. And part of that message is, yes, to attend to the uniqueness of each individual poet without flattening their interventions into the bigger debate. And I'm going to be candid about this. So if you read widely in this poetry, I should speak for myself, I have come across a lot of poetry that I believe doesn't really exceed the documentary impulse, the lament over, say, displacement. And, you know, I feel for the poet, it is generally, I think, legitimate in the context of this work to more or less equate the narrator, the speaker in the poem with the historical person of the author. But it's not as if I am struck by the unparaphrasability of the work. But it's precisely in the oeuvres of other poets, including, by the way, Chen Yanxi and Wu Xia, each in their distinct way, and both of them feature in the documentary Iron Moon, of course, but also Xiaohai, whom I mentioned just now. And we could probably come up with a list of about a dozen poets like this, about whom, let's say, the foreign scholarly translational posse knows enough by now to say, this is how it works, and it's not something to be sneezed at. It is not simply a paraphrasable message. Now, in turn, obviously, there is a linkage to the question about Paul Ricoeur's theory of translation as an ethical undertaking, which has been taken further by, I think it is Emily, if I remember the given name correctly, Maitland, in a book called What is Cultural Translation, where also, let's say, the conventional boundaries between, you know, translation as something that is always reproduced in another language on the one hand, and any source text as a translation are blurred. And in that sense, I think Ricoeur might be very useful, but I also believe, and then I'm also basing this on, let's say, the filtering of Ricoeur through Maitland, that it would be one of several substantial vectors that will have to work together to come up with what I guess is my aim in doing this project. And I've started thinking about a book project, or, you know, a little worried about saying this because it isn't done. And that is something like, not necessarily comprehensive, but an organic picture of this writing. And the issue of ethics, not just in the sense of Ricoeur, is going to come in big time there for every single translator, including the completely under-theorized or under-theorizing translators as well. And perhaps it's something that I should bring in at this point already, certainly for the sort of, you know, the bigger framework when I get to the point where I pull a bunch of stuff together toward a monograph. So thank you very much for that comment and that question.
Great, thank you. So we do have like less than 10 minutes, but I saw that in the audience we have two colleagues, Nick Edmondson and Christopher Lupke, who, so I would like to invite them to ask their questions. Since we cannot meet in person, at least it's nice to have a more direct interaction, not always mediated by my reading.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I put the question in the Q&A, but I'll just read it here. Michiel, and thanks for your talk, by the way. I'm a bit hesitant about the word choice battler, which itself is an issue of translation. I see that the main meaning in Australia captures what you're looking for in Dagong, but I see two problems with that per se. One is that there are not many people familiar with the Australian vernacular outside Australians themselves. The second is that then runs the risk of being culturally marked as Australian. Beyond that, I realize that's kind of arrogant for an American to say, but beyond that, I see two other problems with the term. The first is that battler can be an aggressive term, one who beats on others, an aggressor. And do you want to convey that? I'm guessing not. The other is that battler is the name of a well-known anime character who also is a battler, small b, that is a violent being who has murdered many people. In this larger context, is it a good idea to use the term to describe the Dagong Shiren in China, who are more like underdogs, like the original meaning in Australian English, and are better known for their persistence in strained circumstances, and in some cases, their demise in the face of their precarity?
Thank you for your question. The fact that not many people are familiar with it is not something that would keep me from using it. Now, in itself, that doesn't mean a thing, because that might just mean that I'm misguided. But I could also turn this into almost into a principled matter. And this is not meant to sort of carry on about cultural imperialism and things like that. But I think there are many good things about working with not necessarily the most familiar terms. I'll turn the question around and say it was a lot of fun, as with any untranslatable, because Dagong is very definitely an untranslatable in my book. It would be right up there with Minjian and Jianghu. So I had great fun when I first wrote about this stuff, which was in 2016, when I wrote something wrote a review for MCLC of Iron Moon, I think, and the movie and the book. And that, at that point, I made several suggestions. This was before I'd realized that Battler was going to rescue me, at least in my own eyes, if not in yours. And all of those had problems. And so let's do some more equivalence bashing here. The fact that I have been unable to find a word in English, and by the way, in Dutch, that really does exactly what I feel Dagong does in Chinese, and I did a lot of field work specifically on that, so to speak, isn't necessarily going to keep me from using it, even if that means, or perhaps precisely because it means taking the discussion in a foreignizing direction, if you will. This is not saying that I wouldn't love the day that I finally realize what the right and the only right, not translation for Dagong is going to be. On the second and third objections that you have to the translation, battler generically being perhaps an aggressive, a term that denotes aggression. And do I want to convey this? You guessed right that I do not. And on the anime character, with which I was unfamiliar, the murderer, so to speak, I know what you're saying, but I am reminded, and with apologies for taking this in the direction of telling anecdotes, but I often shave my head. And there was one point where people said to me, this is decades ago, that I shouldn't be shaving my head because there were other groups who shaved their heads and did this for a reason that I probably didn't want to associate with, which was true. And I somehow felt that it would be totally wrong if that was going to stop me from shaving my head. This is not me trying to be belligerent or anything of the sort. This is actually trying to assert my desire to maybe shave my head and not let myself be kept from doing that by somebody else shaving their head if they're not part of my posse, so to speak, and I wouldn't want to be affiliated with them. Perhaps something slightly similar for the anime character. I realize this, but then I get this sense of saying, yeah, but they can't take that away from us. I found David Kelly, an Australian China scholar, sociologist and philosopher, pointed it out to me. At the time, I referenced this in the earliest publications, and I'll reference it again when I do the book, unless before that time you persuade me to find another term. But that's, I guess, for now, without wanting to sound defensive, which I just did for about 3 minutes, why I think I'm going to stick with it. But I'm going to take this on board and write about it. And thank you very much, Chris.
Well, thank you so much. This is so interesting, but I have to cut us short. We have 2 more minutes. I can ask Nick to reformulate this question if he can, so that Mahir can just answer with a yes or no.
Can you guys hear me now? Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Am I still muted? I'm sorry.
We can hear you, Nick. We can hear you, Professor Edmiston. We can hear you.
Oh, shoot. All right. I have some
It's
tech
good.
problems here.
But we can hear you.
I'm intrigued by the way that hypertranslatability indicates or gestures towards the limits of untranslatability. And so I'm wondering if there was if there's a pattern to how the poets that can't do the things that Zheng Xiaoqiong does in advocating for herself and in sort of being out there in the translation world, if the poets who can't do that have something in common, and if it's something that we as sort of transnational scholars should be attending to. And thanks for a great talk. That was really stimulating.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I'll keep this very brief. Paula asked me to do a yes or no. If I had to do this right this minute, I would probably say no, because I don't think it's turning it around again. I mean, there is something very special about Zheng Xiaoqiong that I think is worth studying and also worth theorizing, taking back to the larger community. But I don't think that it is as if the other authors out there are marked positively or otherwise by a particular feature that sort of unites them in visibility. You know, the only good thing about this answer was that it was brief. I look forward to talking more about this, Nick.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We have so many other questions in the Q&A that I was unable to convey, but I think that these questions can be sent to Professor van Crevel for review, and then you can have a further exchange if that is okay. So I would like once again to thank Professor van Crevel for a most fascinating talk. And please note that today's lecture has been recorded and will be posted on the CS YouTube channel once it is published for public viewing. If you're interested in receiving information on upcoming events and to learn about the resources that UChicago Center for East Asian Studies offers, please be sure to subscribe to the center's listserv, and the link to this, as well as to our YouTube channel, will be made available in the chat box, where you may also view past lectures and programs hosted by the center. So thank you again, and everyone, and have a wonderful evening or rest of your day. Thank you so much.